Hi guys, welcome back to Sin and Tonic. Sin and Tonic! Today's story is that of Joel Rifkin. Let's start at the very beginning. This chap was born on the 20th of January in 1959. And 3 weeks after his birth, he was then adopted by Bernard and Jean Rifkin. There's not much to go on with the early childhood here. For all intents and purposes, these guys were loving parents, and that was the case. As he got older, it all started to go pear-shaped. So when he was at school, this is where the trouble sort of began. So he was really badly bullied. He had a bad posture, like they used to call him the turtle. So he was hunched over. He didn't hold himself well, and he moved really slowly. So hence the turtle. So he was hunched and he moved, had a slow gait. From everything that I read, he was nerdy is the word you would say. So the clothes that he wore, the way that he held himself, and he had a very high IQ. He was very intelligent. He had 128 IQ. However, because of the intense bullying that he endured throughout school, he would then avoid being in lessons, or he would try and go to lessons late. And it's not a long stretch, is it? If you're not happy, you're not learning. So his grades then weren't great. And then this caused loads of anger to his father, who was on the committee for the school that he was at. And it was just all horrible, horrifically bullied. It's a tale of woe completely. As I was reading this part of the story and doing my research, you can't help but feel sorry for the kid. I'm not excusing his behaviour and feeling sorry for what he did. I'm feeling sorry for him in the moment when he's at school. It wasn't a pleasant experience. They put his head into the toilet. They would pull his trousers down in front of girls. He tried quite hard to fit in and to be liked. And I guess that's all anyone ever really wants, isn't it? To have friends, to be liked, to have a place. And he didn't have a place. He didn't have friends. He didn't have anything really. So yeah, it wasn't ideal. It wasn't great at all. They stole his lunch money and his books. It sounds like it was just pretty full on all of the time. He was a real target for bullies, and that was his life. Another reason why he failed academically is because he had undiagnosed dyslexia. So despite having an IQ of 128, which is really high, his dyslexia would have definitely got in the way of that and made that even more. I mean, the frustration of being smart but having that thing holding you back, and it was undiagnosed, so no one can help you with it or even knows what's going on. And then to have your dad angry about that as well, at you for something you can't help. It's just the whole thing is just like someone just threw a lump of paint on a page, and his whole school experience just was a mess, and it just sounds awful. Later on, some of the kids at school with him spoke to the press, and they said he was, quote, an abuse unit. I mean, okay, lovely. He tried to join the track team, and they just called him a lard ass, and they used to hide his clothes from him. And rather than he tried because he would then invite them around to his house to drink beer and watch telly. And later on, the classmates again would just say that they just used him. They completely used him. And it's just terrible. So having failed terribly at athletics, again, not a good experience for him, he then joined the yearbook team. And I think it's quite a big undertaking, I'm guessing, in American schools and culture. So he wanted to be a part of that. So he joined the team that make the yearbook. And he had a camera bought a camera. You can see where I'm going with this. So the camera was stolen. So he was undeterred by this. He was determined to join in with something, and he carried on regardless. He slaved away and he worked on the yearbook, but not as a photographer. And then when it was all finished and there was a wrap party for the yearbook group or staff, you know, that had made the yearbook, he wasn't invited. Again, like, what? It angers me. I know kids can be cruel, but really? So he wasn't invited, and his mother said it absolutely devastated him, as it would. It's not nice to be left out, and he was really trying. So that was a shame. And again, yeah, I do feel sorry for him at this point in his life. Not ideal, not great, terrible, being treated really terribly. Like, just, it makes me sad, because I know as well, oh my gosh, I feel like I might cry. I know as well that this just happens all the time. Like, it's more common than people think, and it really, really ruins lives and affects people's lives, and it's just sad. And it's like, no, seriously. If I ever catch wind of bullying or hear any, I'm like that, what? When I pick the kids up from school, I'm like, what are you doing? What are you saying? I've got like an ear out all the time for it, because it's like, no way. Stop it. Kids can be cruel, but you don't have to let them. Around this time, his parents bought Joel Rifkin. I'm going to call him Rifkin. Rifkin? Oh, I better check the names right, because I've done that before, haven't I? Rifkin. So around that time, they bought him a car, his parents, and I watched a documentary on this. It was interesting. It was about the mind and the bullying and all of the things that added up to what kind of makes somebody do this. Like, he was a psychologist, I want to say, and looks at the brain of that person and all the things that have happened in their life and recent triggers and whatnot. And it was really interesting. So what was happening is, in his brain, this guy says, is that he was just completely pulling back from real life, from society, from all of these things that are just like horrible and hurting him all of the time. So this is Rifkin, and he's just pulling away. And in this time period, he was becoming interested in serial killers. So you can't judge, because what do I do most of the time? Yeah. So it's an interesting topic. That's what he was doing at the time. He was like, he had an interest, like others do, in serial killers and what have you. So he was delving into that a bit, and he had some books and whatnot on that topic. Also, he was living in a fantasy world. So he would retreat into this fantasy world that he'd created. And this fantasy world, from things that he'd watched and seen that piqued his interest, was prostitutes and women in a gladiator style fighting over him. Things like that. So, having a bit of control, I imagine, because he probably didn't feel like he had a lot of control over his life. None. And, him being wanted, it seems, was quite a big feature, with the women fighting over him. He's a guy, he obviously wanted attention from the opposite sex. And, so he was retreating into this fantasy world. And in his fantasy world, it created visions of control and stuff, which then became rape and hurting women. So, this is what was going on in his mind, in his fantasy world. It was getting bigger and more creative and elaborate and darker. Mixing that all together, not great. And because of how crap his life was, he just continued retreating into that world, into his safe fantasy world where he has control and he's wanted and all of these emotions that are flying around in this scenario. So when I was watching this documentary, I was like, that is really interesting, isn't it? it was like a control, what's the word, not control, it was like a safety mechanism. Like, my real life is just so crap, I'm going to live here. Like, this is the little world I've created, I'm going to be here. This was like what was going on for him. And then, really sadly, so his dad had cancer, and really, really sadly, his dad, he found out, and then 6 months later, his dad committed suicide. And that's awful and really sad and like terrible. So he then was thrust into a depression. His dad has just passed away. Like, that's just another level of stress and a trigger added on. Also, at this time, his mother and his sister seem to be travelling a lot. Another thing that this guy, psychiatrist, was mentioning, which I found, excuse me, so interesting, was how, what's the word? What's the word? You know, like when you're with your kids and you're like monitoring them, but it's not that word. He was like unmonitored, but that's not the word he used, but I'm going to have to use it because I can't think of the other word. So he was unattended. I don't think that's it either. But like, yeah, he had a lot of unattended time. He was very reclusive in his bedroom and living in his fantasy world and looking up about serial killers. So his mother and father noted that, and that was like spoken about. So he had a lot of time on his own, creating this world and these fantasies and spending a lot of time doing that, like unattended or unmonitored or whatever the word is. Can't think of it. So this psychiatrist said like that you know, it's very unhealthy for that. It's unhealthy. So yeah. Straight away I was like, how much time do my kids spend in their rooms unattended? Not great. All this stuff that's going on. Around this time, he also watched the Alfred Hitchcock movie Frenzy. I've not seen it, but it sounds grim. And it was at this point when he started to fantasise about strangling prostitutes. In 1987, after his father's death, he was arrested for soliciting a prostitute, and it was an undercover police woman. So bad luck. He only got like a fine, so he wasn't sent to prison or anything like that. First offence probably, something along those lines. I don't know how it works. He never did hold down a job or do well, particularly at college, because ultimately, once he'd got his car and a bit of freedom and any money, he was spending that on prostitutes. So it was a little step and a little gateway into like his fantasy world. Before we get to where it gets spicy, he did really well out of character with grades at one point and managed to get an internship. And it was at this internship, which was a real honour for him to get, and for all accounts it sounds like this was like a golden shining moment in his life. This seems to be quite common as well, like there's this sort of pinnacle moment where it's like, and there's a way to go and they go the wrong way. So he met another intern and she was a pretty blonde. He shadowed her all the time apparently, and he was like, going to ask her out, and he never did. He never got up the nerve, but instead he had this sort of like fantasy of her in his head. I mean, that was his go-to, wasn't it? Like his fantasy world, that's always kept him safe and always been there for him, and he never asked her out. He couldn't do it. And I think this might have been the pinnacle of him leaping over the edge, because it was like he had that chance, he had it there, and he couldn't do it, so he just slid down. In March 1989, Rifkin loses control. This is the beginning of his murderous activity, what have you. His mother is going out of town with his sister. He knows that he's got the house to himself. He's often cruising around and sleeping with prostitutes and all that, you know, that's normal to him. He's been arrested for it. Old hat. Now, he recognised that his fantasy thoughts and the violence were worse than normal in his mind. And so he went out like usual, cruising for a prostitute about 10 o'clock at night, and he met a prostitute called Susie. That's what he knew her as. Now, she was heavily addicted to drugs, Susie was. And en route home to his place, she asked him to stop multiple times for drugs and crack, I think it was. And then they went back to his place, and from the sounds of it, she was very high and it wasn't like great fun. And then she requested that when they'd finished or whatever, it's so uncomfortable to talk about, that he drive her around to look for more drugs. So apparently at this point, this is when he just went crazy and he lost his mind. So he picked up a souvenir shell. I think like that's like a gun, bomb type thing. I don't really know much about that sort of thing, like a shell. So it must have been quite big. And he just beat her with it, like a lot. He says he only stopped when he got tired. And remarkably, she was still alive. So she tried to sort of fight back and she bit his finger really deeply. And it was then at that point that he then strangled her to death. He cleaned up, popped her body into a bag, cleaned all the blood. He tidied up the crime scene basically. And I mean, God, how she survived I don't know. So she had fight in her, did Susie. He then fell asleep, hard work, obviously, douche. And then when he woke up, he was like, oh. So he dragged her body down to the basement and he put her like over the tumble dryer or the washing machine. And that's where he then dismembered her body. He removed her fingerprints, grim, and pulled all her teeth out. Things like that, like, fingernails, teeth, no, gets me. So did that, and then he chopped her into 6 pieces, I believe it was. And he squashed her head, is what they said, into a paint tin. For fuck's sake. So basically, when he recounted it, he said he was like going through the motions like it was just a science experiment. Okay. He then put all of the different bits of her. It's hard to know how to speak respectfully. I'll do my best. So he placed her body in all different parts into his truck and he drove across the state line to New Jersey, and he dumped 2 parts of her body in the woods and then another 2 parts in the river. He thought he had been careful and done a great job of disposing of her body. However, a golfer hit his ball into the woodlands not long after and found can you imagine finding that? The can with her head in it. That's grim. That's awful. That, I don't know if I'd get over that, no. So, yeah, found that. So then there was a whole investigation, obviously, into this head in a can or tin, and it made Rifkin unwell because I think he thought like he'd really got away with it or whatever, and no one would ever find her. And also it came out in the press that she was HIV positive, and that freaked him right out. And he was like, whoa, that was close. He felt like it was a close one. So he was careful, and he was like, I'm never going to do it again. And then a year later he did it again. This time met a prostitute, Julie, took her home again. His mother was out of town this time again, and they spent the night together. And then he describes it as at 9 o'clock the next morning, just that he bugged out, or he was bugging out. And he beat her with a table leg and then strangled her to death. So this time he was determined not to mess up the disposal of the body, and he was like, oh, like, I've got to do this properly this time. So he, and to an extent he did, her remains have never been found. The only reason they know is because of his confession. So he used cement, and he used a milk crate and popped her torso in there, and arms and legs in buckets with cement and things like that. And then again he drove off, and he would dispose of them in separate places. I think both times, this time in water, in river, different places. And yeah, so that was what he did this time. Didn't want to have anything be found. April 1991, he started up his own landscaping business, but from the sounds of it, it was just a really half-assed attempt at it. He hired some land and some buildings and stuff like that, and just sounds like it was like, just he had other things on his mind, and he wasn't putting his all into it, and he was getting frustrated with it, and he even said things to his landlord about how slow it was, and then he found a way to use his land and his buildings, and he used it as places to store the bodies of his victims in transit, you know, to the next destination of where he was going to dispose of them. So he found a use for that. On the 13th of July in 1991, he claimed his next victim, Barbara Jacobs. She was a drug addict and a prostitute. This time, he took her back to his home again. His mother and sister weren't there, and did whatever they were going to do. And then he beat her with the same table leg that he'd used on Julie, and again killed her with manual strangulation. This time, though, he didn't fancy dismemberment, wasn't into it. So he sort of wrapped her body, folded her body, and put her into a cardboard box. Just awful, man. And then dropped her into the river with a cement thing. This time she was found hours later by firemen doing what do you call it when they do like a training exercise? This time though, he says, it didn't even faze him. Didn't bother him at all. Whereas the first time he was like, oh, I'm not going to kill it ever again. This time he was like, whatever. The coroner blamed her death on a drug overdose, and it only came out later that it was Rifkin because he confessed to it. Rifkin would continue to meet with prostitutes, and his selection process was very erratic, who he would just sleep with and who he would then kill. It was all over the place really, and he didn't give any rhyme or reasons for who he would pick and why. He would sometimes take women back to his house and beat them and strangle them there, and sometimes he would in his car or his truck. One of the more early times, the first time that he killed somebody in his truck, made him realise how do I get rid of this body? And he bought a big drum, and then he put the body in there and disposed. It's just, 17 women. When people say people are on a rampage, yeah, he was. And he continued this, and he was never caught, and they didn't have anything to go on all of this time. And it's just really frustrating. His final victim was Tiffany. And this just blows my mind because he, by this point, was just so blasé. He met her and then he strangled her, and he had his mother's car this time, his mother's car. And then he just left her body sprawled in the back of her car, drove about, picked up some supplies. No one, not worried about the dead body in the back seat. He then, by the time he got home, he had wrapped her body. He'd stopped and bought tarp and rope, and he'd wrapped her body, and she was now in the boot. When he returned home, his mother was there, and she wanted the car. She was like, I need to go out. God. So he was scuppered. He was like, what? Give me the keys. I want to go shopping. Hurry up. I want to go. I'm leaving now. So she took her car. Oh, I just can't. She took her car and went off and went shopping. I mean, where did she put the shopping? Back seat? She clearly didn't open the boot, or had he done such a good job of like rolled disguising? I don't know. Don't know. Anyway, she returned home and he was like, for you. Got away with that one, didn't I? When he could, removed her body, put it in a wheelbarrow and wheeled it out to the garage. And that's where her body stayed for 3 days, decomposing in the summer heat. And eventually he was like, oh, stinking, like awful, and put her body in the back of his pickup truck. And then off he went to dispose of her body. And this is when he got caught. 2 police officers stopped him, or tried to, because he didn't have a license plate, a rear license plate. So this guy in the documentary I watched, he said it just goes to show how, you know, every area of police work is so important, because people do get caught for bigger crimes by being caught for smaller things. So he was just like, yeah, cool. Like, it worked this time, didn't it? So they tried to stop him and he didn't stop. So he drove off and they had like this high police chase. And eventually he crashed. Pesky number plate got him caught, didn't it? Well, thank God. He was then interrogated for 8 hours by the police. They found the body, obviously, in the back of his truck and it's really stunk apparently. So they stopped him and were like, why were you running? And, you know, you haven't got a number plate, guy, you know, come on, like, what's wrong with you? And then it smelled, and then they found the body of Tiffany. Just so sad. So they found Tiffany, and then obviously they arrested him, and then he was interrogated for 8 hours. Now, it was said when he was arrested, he said, she's a prostitute, it all went wrong, and I ended up strangling her. Do I need a lawyer? And he never got a lawyer, and he was interrogated for 8 hours and never once with a lawyer, and they weren't recording him. They didn't record his confessions or anything, because he confessed to 17 murders. So it felt a bit sketchy, that. It's like, whoa, what are you doing? Whoa, a bit scary, because effectively, like, they could have just thrown his confession out of court, because there's no proof of it other than a written statement, which could have been written. You know, it's bizarre, isn't it, that? He wasn't very pleasant when he was recounting the murders. He used numbers instead of their names. He called them events or incidents. He didn't refer to them by name, or it's just a terrible person. They sent police to his mother's house to have a look, obviously, with a warrant. And then after they'd finished looking, that's when his mother called for legal counsel, for a lawyer. That lawyer called the police and said for them to stop interrogating him, and they didn't. They carried on for another hour until he'd finished telling them about all of the escapades that he'd been up to. So Rifkin pleaded not guilty, despite having confessed. I think he was hoping for not guilty by reason of insanity, is what he was hoping. He fired his lawyer and hired 2 new ones. He just had a big old ego. He was like, no, I'm not going to have this. They tried to squash the confession, and to be fair, so would I. They didn't record it. He didn't have a lawyer present for like ever. Like, I'm not sure what was going on there. That seems a bit dodged, doesn't it? And a bit like careless. Like, my God. I mean, he was confessing left, right and centre. So you think you'd be like, whoa, get this on record. But no, weird. He was convinced that he would be acquitted for insanity. The jury had none of it. They were like, no, like, you're not insane. The prosecution just said, you know, he confessed, he has done all of this horrible stuff, and he's now just making a mockery of mental health and insanity, and it's crazy, and it's like not fair. Crazy is the wrong word maybe to say, like, you know, it's not right. And they agreed, and then he was sentenced to 203 years to life and will be eligible for parole in 2197. Okie dokes. He's tried over the years, he's tried to get out, he's tried to appeal, and he's tried to use the, sorry, I've got a crick in my neck, the fact that he didn't have a lawyer and all that stuff, which is wrong, but he's tried to use that multiple times to appeal his conviction. But that wasn't his confession and stuff. They had a lot of evidence against him, Mehdi, a lot. He had kept souvenirs, over like hundreds of things from his victims. They were all found at his house. Diaries and things of the women. It's just like there was overwhelming. There was overwhelming evidence that he had murdered these women. So none of his appeals have ever amounted to anything. And it looks, you know, he's hardly going to get to 2197 to get out. Ugh. Super thankful that those cops pulled him over with his missing licence plate, thank God, because who knows how many more women he would have gone on to kill and when eventually he would have got caught, and it doesn't bear thinking about. But well done to them because they caught him. This has been delightful, this gin. I'm going to move on now and talk about that, I think. First things first is the tonic. London Essence. I didn't keep the top, but it had a le on it and it was cute. I like it. Really, really nice. That's a really nice tonic water. And the little bits and bobs came in with the kit. And actually, they give it a real fragrant taste. It's nice. And again, like last week, I used my Christmas gin. So I think for the month of December, we don't need to talk about it because it will be the Christmas gin. If it's not, I'll let you know. But yeah, this was my first time experiencing the London Essence and I really like it. It's nice. Lovely. So, not much to really say about that one other than the fact that, thank God for cops doing all of their jobs and catching him. Now I need to go and lay in a certain position or have a hot bath because I've hurt my neck. Thank you for joining me this week for another episode of Sin and Tonic, and I really hope you'll join me next week for another true crime story and a lovely glass of gin. Bye!